Okay. So last week, we were discussing several different positioning techniques, and we were talking about the box model a lot. So the box model is basically where we have the padding, where we have the margin, and all of those things outside of the width and height of the content. So one of the better illustrations of this is if you go on the class website, one of the links regarding the box model kind of shows this graphically, where you have the content itself, you have the padding outside of that, you have the border outside of that, and you have the margin outside of that. And very often, if you don't have a border or you don't have a margin, the padding, if you don't have a border or a background image or background color, then the padding and margin will look about the same. It's just spaced kind of around the content. But as soon as you put in a border or a background color or a background image, then the difference between that padding and that margin makes a lot more of a difference. And the background image and the background colors, we found out, happen all within the border as well. So the padding is between the content and the edge of that space, where the space would also include that background color and the background image. So last week we were playing around with as far as like different ways of doing the float and the clear, and how that all intersects with the margins and the padding. If you remember, open up the style sheet. If you remember with the second div that we have here, this is a second div. We have this purple background color on it, and it is floating. It's floating to the left, and because we have a float on it, and because we have a specific width on it, that means it's going to be horizontally aligned with the third div that we have here on the right. The third div, we have this red background color on it. We also have a little bit of padding on it, we have some margin on it, and it's floating to the right. The combination of float as well as a specific width allows these two boxes to be horizontal from each other, so next to each other horizontally. Divs naturally try to expand to the whole width of the screen, so we have to make sure that we keep that in mind when we're trying to position things horizontally. We have to actually kind of rein in what it is using a width. We don't always need to have a height, and a lot of times it will just make the height whatever it needs to be in order to actually accommodate the content, the text, or the images that are inside of it. But when we try to put on both a height and a width, sometimes if the content is too much for it, it might have unpredictable results where it's actually kind of spilling over the container that we're trying to set for it. So today, I'd like to talk about the position attribute, where if you go on the class website, I do have a link to an article talking about various ways that we can use the position property rather in CSS. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start with just a very blank file. And if you're looking at this when I zip up the files for later on, this is going to be position.html. I'm starting with just a very blank normal HTML template, and I'm going to grab some content so that we have something to work with here.
Thank you.
So let's grab a few paragraphs here. and I put this all within the body. Around each paragraph, I'm going to wrap a div with an ID. So we have the div tag. One step at a time. We have the div tag, which we have the start and we have the end for the div. And inside the beginning div tag, I'm going to go ahead and add in an ID. I'm going to call this div1. And I give it an ID so that I can reference it later on in the CSS. I'm going to call the second one div2. And I'm going to call this third one, you guessed it, div3. So for this example, I want to make sure that each div is on its own. I'm making sure that I'm closing the previous div before I open a brand new one. And this gives us 3 different divs to work with when we come to our CSS. So let's go ahead and in our files, let's go ahead and create a new CSS document. So in brackets, I can just say file new, and I'm going to save this in the same place as my HTML file. I'm just going to call this, let's call this position style.css, just so it's clear that that's the one that we're doing for this HTML file. Before I go too much further with the CSS, let's make sure that we link the CSS file to this HTML file. So in the head, I'm going to go ahead and create a link tag. I'm going to say type equals text/CSS. I'm going to say rel equals style sheet. And I'm going to say href equals, and this is going to be the path to the CSS file as well as the file name, and in this case it's just simply the file name because we don't have it in anything else. We're going to end the link tag with just a /angle bracket, and these are the 3 things in the link tag that we need in order for it to link to the proper CSS file. We need the type attribute, we need the rel attribute, and we need the href attribute. So okay, so when we have the link tag, we typically put in a type, and you can see that when it comes to brackets will very often try to give us some suggestions when we do this. It looks like for this one we only have one option. This is one of those things where you might find it works without the type text CSS. But in order for it to be as reliable as possible on all the different browsers, and in order for it to make sure that we kind of read it on older browsers especially, this is just kind of the standard that we include in the type tag to make sure that it knows that it's a CSS file. There are other kinds of files that we could potentially link to this HTML document. But the most common one is CSS, which is what we use this link file for, link tag for, and we just have to tell the browser exactly as it is. These 2 attributes, the type and rel, are literally exactly what they need to be. Whereas the other attribute href here might change depending on as far as the name of the file as well as the path to it. But yeah, so it's just one of those things which is kind of standard to make sure that it works, but like I said, you might have found that it works without it just because some browsers are more forgiving. So we have the link so that it knows to look for the CSS file, and let's go ahead and make sure that we are definitely able to see the difference between these three divs. Right now, if I run this without any CSS in here whatsoever, I just have 3 paragraphs here. I can barely even tell that they're 3 independent paragraphs because they just end up right after the other. If I use the paragraph tag, it will naturally have a little bit of space here, but we like to use divs instead of paragraphs just because we don't want to have to worry about overwriting what natural padding or margins already in there. So divs give us a blank slate to work with, so we can put in our own padding and margins. So let's go ahead and identify these 3 divs. I'm going to say div hash, and then this is where I use the ID name, which I'm calling div1. So I'm going to use div hash div1, and then a set of curly braces. So we have the tag name hash the ID name in order to identify that specific div there. If this was a class instead of an ID, then I would use a period instead of the hash number sign. And again, the choice of using an ID or class is mostly up to your whatever kind of makes more sense for you. The only restriction on IDs, however, is the fact that you can only use the same ID name once in an HTML document. So I can only use this exact ID name div1 once in the same HTML document. I could use it in multiple HTML files, so I could have an ID called menu that I'm using in multiple files, but I can only use this once in the same document. Whereas a class, you would naturally use that multiple times. Yes?
Yeah, I was getting a little confused about when to make it an ID or class, but I guess for a thing that would stay the same always would probably be your footer and navigation. Like that would be a hard thing to ID.
Sure. When in doubt, I would go with a class instead of an ID. Because even if you only use a class once, it doesn't hurt anything. If you try to use a ID more than once, then again, sometimes you're going to get unpredictable results. So, like I said, when in doubt, just use a class, but IDs are good for identifying. IDs are good for recognizing when you're only planning on using something once in your HTML document. So we have div with the ID div1. I'm going to add in a few things here. I'm going to add in a background color. So I'm going to do background dash color. I'm going to use the hex value for red. So I'm going to do FF0000. I could also use the text red in this case, but hexes tend to be more flexible.
How about for background you don't use color, you just say background?
So typically if you're just saying background, what it's going to do is it's going to expect naturally, it's going to expect more than just the color. It's going to expect like what you have for the image, it's going to expect what you have for the position, it's going to expect what you have like for the repeat and things like that. So kind of like with the border, when we say a border, like we would say, for example, 2 pixels, solid, and then some sort of color. So we have 3 different values. We have the width, we have the style, and we have the color, all within border. Technically, when you do background, you're supposed to be doing multiple properties with background. Again, it's one of those things you might find that it does work if you just have the color in there. However, it's one of those things that's technically wrong, so it might have unpredictable results on different browsers. The most reliable way, if you just care about the color in the one line, is to just do background dash color. So we have background color, we have a red, yeah, let's get that border on there. We have a black border, 2 pixel border on here. Let's add in a little bit of padding. I'm going to say 40 pixels of padding, and this is going to do 40 pixels on all 4 sides because I only have one number in here. If I did 2 numbers in here, this would take the first number and do 20 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 40 pixels on the left and right. And if I had 4 numbers in here, it's going to put 4 different values for the padding. And it's going to start with the top. The second one's going to be the right. Third one's going to be the bottom. Fourth one is going to be the left. Just basically like a clock, top, right, bottom, left.
You just said trouble, which I thought was helpful. Trouble, like TRP,
Yeah, that works too. I always thought of the clock. I never used that acronym before, but yeah, it's a good one. But yeah, I would just suggest like whatever padding method makes sense for what it is you're trying to do. In this case, I'm going to do the same padding all 4 sides. So we have padding 40 pixels, and I'm going to do a margin of 20 pixels. So this gives us a box that we're going to be able to see pretty easily, with a background color, a border, a padding, and a margin. I'm going to copy this exact same thing. I'm going to copy it 2 more times. So this first one we have div 1. I'm going to set the second one to div 2. And the third one to div 3. And the only thing I'm going to change so far is just the background color. So this first one is red. I'm going to make the second one green. So I'm going to do 00FF00. And the third one I'm going to make blue. So 0000FF. Which, of course, you can always get these hex values from any of the color pickers. We're using these, finding the color that you want. You can pull the hex value here in that color picker. So let's take a look at the monster we've created here. Okay. So we have 3 different divs. We have a red, a green, and a blue divs here. So, whenever we talk about any sort of position, we always have to think, first and foremost, what is the natural flow of things? How does the browser want to, by default, deal with these different divs, deal with these different anchor tags, images? How does it naturally want to deal with these before we put any sort of CSS on it? So, as you can see that when we didn't have any sort of CSS at all, it just simply stacks the divs one after the other. It's going to try and use these divs at 100% of the width of the screen, and it's adjusting the height of each of these divs naturally based on the content inside of them. So it's just wrapping the text in there because we don't specify a height for any of these divs. So it's making the height relative as it needs to. But without any sort of width, without any sort of floats, it's still going to try and stack these divs vertically one after the other. Now, when you're dealing with your own design, we're going to be working off of this design here. When you're dealing with your own design, it's natural to start thinking about this in rows, first and foremost. So, we can kind of see this whole thing as like we have a row here, which would represent our header. We have a row here which represents our content, and we have a row here which could represent our footer. Now within each of those major sections, like so, we have this row here for our content. Within each of those major sections, we can kind of think about how we're positioning the individual elements here. We have 2 major elements within the content. And here we have 5 major elements. We have the logo, and we have these 4 different menu items. But we always start off with kind of what is on the outside, And a lot of times with these different rows, we can kind of think about using divs, as they are, because it's naturally going to stack them vertically. Now, when we introduce the position property, I'm going to put in a position property on the second div. First of all, for position, we have a few different options here. The most common options that we use for position are absolute, fixed, and relative. Static is really just the default, so there's not really any reason why you use static. And inherent is taking what was kind of before it. And sticky is relatively new. I'm not too familiar with sticky, but the most common values that we use again for position are absolute, fixed, and relative. Let's start with absolute. God bless you. So when we put in position absolute, the first thing you're going to notice is that the green div is now on top of the blue div. If you remember, the green div is the second one here. So the green div actually stays in the same place as soon as we put on position, but the blue div comes underneath that. So when we put in position absolute, it's actually taking the green div out of the natural flow of things, and it's assuming that it doesn't really take up any space. Position absolute is one way that we can very specifically force the position in a very specific place on our page. A lot of times we're using the position absolute with two other properties, particularly top and left. And we use top and left to specify exactly where we want it on the screen. So for example, if we do a top of 40 pixels and we do a left of 400 pixels, you're going to see that no matter where it was before, it's going to position this green box approximately 40 pixels from, it's doing it approximately 40 pixels from the top and 400 pixels from the left. But again, it's taking the green box that's our div 2. It's taking the green box, the only one that we have the position absolute on. It's taking it out of the natural flow, which means that the blue box is going to come right underneath the red. So again, without that position absolute, the blue box just kind of falls in line vertically with all the other divs. But as soon as we put that in there, the blue box basically pretends that the green box never existed, and it just is going to come up in that space. So, you might assume that the position as far as the top and left work the same way as the margin top and the margin left. However, they actually are a little bit different. If we're using position absolute, we keep position absolute in there, and we say margin top 40 pixels and margin left 400 pixels. What it's going to do is it's going to position it 40 pixels from the top and 400 pixels from the left, from wherever it was supposed to be. So it was supposed to be right here in this corner. This green box is supposed to be right here in this corner. So it's doing 40 pixels from the top of where it was supposed to be there, and 400 pixels from the left of where it was supposed to be there. So when we do margin top and margin left, we still take into account where it was supposed to be, whereas top and left, just top and left, force it in a very, very specific spot at that from the top and left of the corner of the browser, basically. So 400 pixels from the left of the corner of the browser, 40 pixels from the top corner of the browser. So we do the left and right on that. Any questions on this so far?
David was teaching us the new box model, so if we did that way, would you still, I guess you can still apply this to the box.
Sure, yeah. Again, there's a lot of different options out there, so you want to just kind of choose what makes the most sense for what it is you're actually trying to accomplish in your design. As much as possible, you want to try to keep it as simple as you can. So you don't want to just start throwing in, like, with a div, like, okay, let me put in position, let me put in margin, let me put in top, left, and all these things. You want to start off just thinking about, like, the size of it, and then thinking about the position of it from wherever it's supposed to be. So always try to start off simple and then adding complexity as you need to. So yes. In addition to actually kind of forcing it out of the natural flow of things, you'll see that it's actually also overlapping too. So how does the browser decide what's going to be on top and what's going to be on bottom? Right now, we only have position absolute on one of our divs. So that's going to be the thing that actually takes precedence. So we have position absolute on our green div, what we're calling div 2 here. We have position absolute on our green div, so that's going to be the thing that's naturally going to be on top of everything else. Now, if we have position absolute on more than one div, let's also put in a position absolute on div 3. And let's go ahead and set this to a top of, let's say 500 pixels, and a left of 200 pixels. So, we have position absolute on div 3. We have a top of 500 pixels, which is moving it much farther down, and a left of 200 pixels, which is not quite as far left. That was actually a bit farther down than I was expecting. Let's go ahead and do 100 pixels on the top. Okay. So we now have position absolute on two different elements, and right now, because they're trying to take up the same space, they're naturally going to overlap each other. So again, trying to think about how the browser decides what order, what stacking order to put these in. So if both the green box and the blue box both have position absolute on them, the first thing the browser is going to do, if they're taking up the same space, if they're not, like we had the blue box down further down below before, if they are taking up the same amount of space, the browser is going to prioritize, or basically make on top, whichever one is actually lower in our HTML. So in our HTML, we have, we first are projecting the div 2 on the screen, and then we're projecting div 3. So in addition to the browser naturally trying to print things from the top to the bottom and left to the right, it's also going to start from the back to the front. So we have div 1, which doesn't have any other positioning on it. It's always going to be in the back, no matter what. We have div 2, which has position absolute, so that's going to overlap, just going to try to overlap everything. And then we have div 3, and since both of these, div 2 and div 3, have position absolute, the browser is going to make the second one, or whichever comes lower in our HTML, it's going to make that one on top. Now, if I swap the order of these, so I actually move div 3 above div 2, then you'll see that these two divs exist in the exact same place, but it simply swaps the front to back order of these two divs. Now, I gotta put these back in order. I'm gonna do div 2 first and then div 3. Now there's also a way to force that front to back order if we don't want to be slaves to exactly how it has it, the order that we have it in our HTML. Within our style, what we can do is we can add in, I'm going to do this on the green box, on the one that's actually behind. We can add in the property z-index. So z-index is kind of a funny value. Z-index is just a very simple number, and the higher that number is, the closer it is to you. So we're not putting in pixels, we're not putting in any other kind of units. It's just simply going to be a number. So we can put in 10, for example. And this one has a z-index and this one doesn't, so it's naturally going to assume that this one is supposed to be higher. The z-index is by default going to be a 0. So everything starts off at 0. So as long as this is greater than 0, it's going to actually be higher. And then for the blue box, if we wanted that to be higher, we would just we can set the z-index to something higher than a 10, like 100. So if you're using z-indexes, whichever one has the higher z-index is going to be the one that's on top. If you're not using z-indexes, but both these have position absolute, it's going to be dependent on the order that exists in your HTML. But yeah, so we have position absolute, and position absolute is a way of, as it sounds, absolutely positioning something in a certain spot on our page. It's one of those types of positioning that unfortunately is not very flexible. So right now, as I change like the size of the browser, like if I was trying to center everything in my document, or I wanted to have things kind of a little bit more relative or more fluid as we resize the browser. It's still forcing it in the exact same place, whereas everything else could be dependent on the whatever sort of centering we're doing with the body. So, for example, I think that we went over this last week, but if not, I'll show you right now. For just a moment, let's go ahead and take out the position absolute that we're doing for both div 2 and div 3. At the very top of our CSS, I'm going to identify the body. And in the body, I'm going to give it a width of, let's say, 500 pixels. And I'm also going to say margin 0 pixels auto. So what this is going to do is for the entire body, which is everything in that's going to be visual, everything that's in my HTML should go within this body. So for the entire body, I'm going to make the entire thing a width of 500 pixels, and I'm using margin 0 pixels auto to center that content. So like I said, a div is going to naturally try to be 100% of its container, and if we don't have any sort of specific width on the body, it's going to just be 100% of the browser. But now that I have a 500 pixel width on the body, it's naturally going to be the divs at 100% is going to be exactly that 500 pixels. So with the margin 0 pixels auto, I have 0 pixels on the top and bottom as far as the margins, but auto on the left and right. And by using auto instead of a certain number of pixels for the left and right, it's going to center that information. So whenever we have the width and the margin 0 pixels auto on the body, it's going to create a centered column of information so that whatever we have as far as like a background color, a background image, that's going to crop, but as we shrink down the browser screen, it's going to center that column of content in the browser. Once we get underneath the 500, then yes, we do still have to scroll left and right. But at least as long as it's the browser is bigger than whatever we set up as the width here, it's going to be a centered column. And you're using margin with both 0 pixels and the auto?
Oh, I had a space. I had a space between 0 and
Oh,
between the 0
yeah.
and the P, so
Yeah. Sure. So, what you're talking about is, like, say that we have in our HTML, we'll do this from the HTML first. Say that for div 1, this is representing our header. We have div 2 and div 3. Let's go ahead and put that inside of its own div. And very often we actually call this, as you said, a wrapper. We don't have to call it that, but it's a common term for this. So I'm going to start a div with the ID wrapper here, and I'm going to end that div after div 3. So that both div 2 and div 3 are inside of this wrapper. So we have the wrapper here, and we have div 2 and div 3 inside of that. Now in our CSS, I'm going to take out the width 500 pixels and 0 pixels auto on the body, because otherwise that's going to center everything. But I'm going to define div hash wrapper, and here I'm going to put back in that width of 500 pixels and the margin of 0 pixels auto. So, because I'm using the width and margin 0 pixels auto method on just the wrapper, and because that wrapper is only around div 2 and div 3, now when I take a look at it, the red box is still expanding to the whole, the majority of the whole screen, but the div 2 and div 3 is a centered column within that. So we still doing a centered column for the div 2 and div 3 because that has its own wrapper. Now, right now the red box does still have some space around it, and that's due to a few different things. One, in our CSS, we do have a margin on div 1, so we would take that out. So that's a little bit closer, but there's still a little bit of room here. Naturally, the body tag is going to have a tiny bit of margin and padding on it already. So if we want things to be flush against the left and right of the screen, as well as the top of the screen, then in the body we have to set the margin to 0 pixels and the padding to 0 pixels. So by setting the margin to 0 pixels and the padding to 0 pixels in the body, then that allows our div, which doesn't have any extra margin on it, to be exactly flush against the top and the left and right of the screen. But again, because we have the width and the margin 0 pixels auto on the wrapper, then that has our center column, and the rest of it is expanding to the whole width. So,
the body and the wrapper, that's already touched.
I also took off, as far as the div, I took off the positions on div 2 and div 3 a while ago, but I also took off the margins on div 1, yeah. So, one other thing I want to show you regarding the position property. Let's go ahead. Okay. So let's go ahead and put, for right now, I'm going to put the width and the margin 0 pixels auto. I'm going to put that back on the body. So that is going to be a centered column again. And for our HTML, let's go ahead and take this wrapper out for a minute. So we are back to our normal divs. And I'm going to add some more, a few more paragraphs to our div 3, just to make this page a bit longer. So right now I have the width and the margin 0 pixels auto on the body. With the divs, let's go ahead and add that margin back in for div 1. So for the divs, we still have as far as the background colors and the borders, and just a little bit of padding and margin for each one. So right now it just looks like this. We have our red div, we have our green div, and we have our very long blue div here. Okay. So like I said, we have this centered column, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some extra positioning on our green div here. So first, let's go ahead and add back in the position absolute. And we're going to put in a top of 50 pixels and a left of 100 pixels. So, like I said, as before, it takes it out of the natural flow, which means the blue box moves up. And the green box is 100 pixels from the top and exactly 100 pixels from the left. Now, if you remember, we have a centered column here for the body. As I expand on the size of the browser, the green box is staying put. Because I have a 100 pixels on the left for div 2, because I have a 100 pixels on the left for div 2, that means that it's not going to be centered along with its fellow divs here. It's going to be exactly 100 pixels from the left. So if you're interested in doing a centered column here, position absolutes can sometimes be a little bit tricky because it's going to force it into one specific spot. Now, the other kinds of positionings that I wanted to go over were position fixed and position relative. So, with position absolute, you'll notice that it is 50 pixels from the top and 100 pixels from the left. That's where this green box is starting. When I go to scroll this page, the green box is 50 pixels from the top of wherever the rest of the HTML or rest of this content is actually starting. So as I scroll, it's still 50 pixels from the top, but 50 pixels from the top of that content. With div 2, if I say position fixed instead of position absolute, as soon as I refresh it, it looks exactly the same. But when I go to scroll, it's going to stay in the exact same position. It's going to be 50 pixels, not from the top of the content, but from the top of the window. So when it's position absolute, it's going to be 50 pixels from the top of the content. So as I scroll, it's going to move with the rest of the content. But when I have position fixed, it's going to be 50 pixels from the top of the window. So that means that as I scroll, it's always going to be in the exact same place, no matter what's scrolling behind it. This is how people will very often have a fixed header, like a fixed menu, or a fixed footer, or sometimes people even just have a fixed sidebar, so that it will just always stay in the same place, no matter how you scroll. So your content for your website, for most of them, is not too long. But if you would like to do this, for a few of you that have a bit of a longer design, even for like the about page, you could do like a fixed menu if you would like, and that way you would always have access to the menu, and you wouldn't have to scroll all the way up to get to the back to the menu if you want to go to a different page. It's a common aesthetic, and it's up to you if that's something that you would like to include in your design. Any questions on that? Okay. The last thing is position relative. Now, the thing about position relative is that position relative will not necessarily take things out of the natural flow, or at least, I'm sorry, it won't force it into a top and left like position absolute and position fixed. You can see that where I'm putting in top of 50 and left of 100, it's putting in a 50 pixels from the top and 100 pixels from the left of where it's supposed to be naturally. So, if I do position relative with top and left of 100 pixels, it's actually doing the exact same thing as if I did simply margin top of 50 pixels and a margin left of 100 pixels. So for the most part, these two, this group of properties here and this group of properties here, are doing almost the same thing, with only one difference here. So, just kind of show you back and forth. This is with position relative. We have a top of 50 pixels and a left of 100 pixels. If I refresh it, this is where the green box ends up. 50 pixels from the top of where it's supposed to be, and 100 pixels from the left of where it's supposed to be. If I do the margin top of 50 pixels and margin left of 100 pixels, again, we have it 50 pixels from the top of where it's supposed to be, 100 from the left of where it's supposed to be there. The only difference, as you can see, is how it's actually adjusting the width as well as the overlap. So when we do the position instead of the position relative method, and we don't use the margin left and margin top method, you see we actually have the option of overlapping things. So if you like to do an overlap, but you still want things to be pretty flexible as far as like having things centered, then position relative might be the way to go if you want to force a bit of that overlap. Like I said, position absolute and position fixed are very, very forceful, and it kind of makes it in an exact position on the screen. Position relative will still be pretty flexible if you're trying to center things or you're trying to have content relative to one side of the screen, but it will also allow you to do the overlap. I would recommend, if you're not trying to do any sort of overlap and you're not trying to force it into one exact place, I would actually stay away from the position property for the most part. Position property can be very useful kind of within certain sections, but not for like, you know, the major sections. So yes, I would like to get into starting to build out that design that I showed you. But any questions so far?
So to use that on an image, would you would make the image display as a block and then use the div on it? In other words, my logo is an image.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I want it to be in the corner of the screen. In the exact same spot and everything.
Okay.
It seems like position.
Well, one thing that you would have to ask is, do you want to do like the center column thing, or do you want to do everything from the left? From what I remember from your design, you could do either one, but it seemed like you were more focused on doing everything from the left. So in that case, if you're not trying to like do the center column, you could potentially do use a position in that case, like using position relative, or position absolute to put it in the exact same place. You probably also don't even have to do it because it's like something that is in the top and left. You don't have to worry too much about other things bumping it down or bumping it to the left as far as things that are coming before and after it.
But I
The
want
logo,
a specific spot. I don't want it right at the top. You don't want it all the way to the left.
yeah. So what you could do is you could just simply use the margin top, the margin left, as a way of pushing it just a little bit
That's what I
off.
thought. Okay.
So another thing is you were talking about as far as using the image as a block. Images typically are going to be in line with everything else. If we have a whole bunch of text and an image somewhere in between, it's actually going to put that image just actually in line, just like it would with the bold tag or an italics tag, with the rest of the content. So one way to kind of treat it like a block is to kind of force on that image the property display block. Another way to do it is if you actually wrap that image inside of a div that's already a block, it kind of at least saves you one step as far as kind of forcing an image as a block rather than using a div as what it's supposed to be.
I was trying to do that. I couldn't get it to work. But I'll try.
A lot of times there's multiple ways of accomplishing the same exact result. I encourage you to always try to find the simplest. If it's growing like more and more complicated, you always want to try to take a step back and say, is there a simpler way of doing this exact thing? So I have this design here, and ideally we want to find a way to make this happen in our HTML. So whenever it comes to actually looking at a design, we always want to think of things in rectangles. Like we just want to divide the design in a series of rectangles so that it's we work from the outside in, and we think about like the widths and the positions in that way. So I would always recommend starting off with very, very large sections and then working your way in. So first, this does seem to kind of want to be a centered column type of a format. So I would say the very first thing is we have some sort of wrapper here that's going to go around just about everything, and this is going to be our centered column. Now you might say, what about this cool space background that you have here? If it's something that's supposed to be full bleed, then let's make that the background properties on the body. Let's not try to put this background in a div or like anything else. If it's supposed to be full bleed, let's make sure that it's on the body itself, just to kind of simplify things. So what I would do first if I was breaking up this design is I would want to export that background. So I would pretty much hide everything. Taking this design, I would pretty much hide everything, and then I would do the save for web, so that I can save just this background as a, I would probably do this as a JPEG. It could probably look fine as a GIF, but this is more of a JPEG in this case. Now, like I said, if you download that zip, you're going to have a bunch of different images already exported out, some which we might use today and some which we might not. So I'm going to skip that part of it, but just to kind of show you again like how I would actually go about breaking this up. So, yes.
Have you just exported as a part of the background, or are you planning to link that to both?
Well, that's a good question. So, if I did it as part of the background, so if I exported this that included the faces in it, then as I tried to position other things on top of it, I would want, top of it vertically, I would want to make sure that the space is enough for this content. Personally, at least in this particular case, I'm going to actually export that as its own image. That way, in case the content that I have up here, in case it's longer or higher than I'm expecting, then then this image is just going to naturally push down. So my idea for this particular design is that this is the overall template, and whatever the content is going to go here in the middle. So it's always going to have this header, it's always going to have this footer. So the content itself might be different depending on like what that actual page actually is. So there might be cases where you decide like, yeah, let's just save it as part of the image. I don't care if there's something on top of it, or I don't care if the text is too long and it actually ends up overlapping it. That's fine. Like I said, always try to simplify things if you can. Another example is, if you take a look, there's actually a tiny little ship here in the top right corner. I could decide, let's see, I always want to have that ship there. I could export that, I actually did at some point, export that as its own JPEG, and I could, kind of try to position it. But for the most part, I'm not really going to worry too much if something overlaps that in this context. And it's also pretty high already on the page, so I'm not going to worry too much about anything overlapping it if I keep my centric column the way that I'm going to intend. So that's the case where it's, yeah, let's go ahead and save that as part of the background image. But where I have my footer, I'm going to save that separately so that I can use this as a template and the footer will just naturally push down. Any other questions? Okay. So in this particular case, again, I would first save the background. I'm using the save for web in order to save that out to make sure that it's going to be the right file format as well as the right size. So yeah, I would save that background first.
Sorry for
Yep.
In my case, I did my layout in Illustrator. So I did import my background. I saved the image as a JPEG.
Yeah, that's
from
fine.
Illustrator. So does that matter?
I would still, an Illustrator also still has, if you go under File, Export, it still also has the Save for Web. Both Photoshop and Illustrator have that option. And I'm, as far as like hiding these different layers on top of it, however you would typically isolate something is perfectly fine. And again, I would still recommend doing the Save for Web because otherwise, just as far as like the file format, yeah, it might be too big, but also just making sure that it's, like I said, the Save for Web takes care of the fact that it needs to be 72 dpi. It also needs to be RGB, and also again, as far as like just generally the size of it. So the Save for Web kind of takes care of a lot of different things for you. Whereas when you just simply do Save As, you're just not sure, just depending on how you have the alternate file set up. So we have the background, and pretty much whenever I'm going to need to save anything else that is going to go on top of this, I'm actually going to remove the background altogether, so I have the checkerboard. Now, we have our logo and our menu up here, and depending on what it is you're actually trying to do, maybe... Oh, I have this transparency, that's right. Maybe you could use this as real type, as far as like what you have like for your menu or for your logo. But if it's not something that is in the typekit, it's not something that you have in Google Fonts, and you're only planning on using it in a couple of places, it's perfectly fine to export it as like an image as that text, if that's something that you really want to use. When it comes to what is considered body copy, or like the actual copy of the content, then that's where you want to settle for something you can actually use as real live type. whether that is like a typical aerial or times, or you're actually utilizing something out of the type kit or Google Fonts for that real type there. But like I said, in cases where like you really want to use that type, but it's not available in that other case, then yeah, feel free to actually export that as an image. So this is where there's a few different ways of doing this in Photoshop, but very often what I'll do is, assuming I have this Photoshop file backed up, I'll pretty much just merge everything and then do the wand with a 0 tolerance, and I take off the anti-alias, and then if we wand around, do these inverse and crop around just the thing that I actually want. Then I can go to image and crop, and now I have just that one menu item isolated. Now I do need to isolate this separate from everything else, because that is something which is going to be actually clickable. I want video to be clickable, different than About, Gallery, or Journal. I don't have to break up Go Boldly into 3 or 4 different parts. That can all be one image. But anything that needs to be clickable by itself, like the video, then yes, that's something that I would want to isolate by itself. Now I do have a drop shadow on this, and I have a slight transparency with that drop shadow. And assuming I did this right, you're looking at a slight transparency on that black, which means that if I do the save for web, if it's a JPEG, then it's going to ignore the entire background. And if it's a GIF or a PNG 8, then that means it's going to fill in that slight transparency and make it kind of a hard edge. So in this particular case, I would want to do a PNG 24 in order to get a softer edge and the slight transparency on that shadow. We don't want to use PNG 24s all the time, but wherever it's actually appropriate, where we want a slight transparency or a softer edge, PNG 24 is the way to go for that. So, in this particular case where I want to save this this typeface, but it's not something available to Google Fonts, I would export the logo. I would export these different images out separately. I'm actually even exporting out this that I have for the video player, as well as this that I have for the text box. Now, obviously, I'm going to replace this with real type. But sometimes it helps to have just a screenshot just for positioning's sake, just to get generally things positioned the way that we want it to before we replace it with the real content there. So yeah, I did actually export out a video JPEG and a text PNG that represents those two sections. And I did also export out the footer as its own image. One last thing, you'll see that I exported out a yellow version of all the menu items. Eventually what I'd like to do is I'd like to set it up so that as I hover over anything in the menu here, it's going to swap to the yellow version of that text. So that as I hover over it, do I have that version here? But as I hover over it, it's actually going to swap to that yellow. But we're going to be going over that next week, how to do that sort of image swap and hover effect. So, like I said, just in the planning aspect of it, when I have all the images exported out, I'm going to work from the outside in. I'm going to be using this space as a background image. And the very next thing inside the body is going to be this wrapper, because this is one of those cases where I'd like to do a centered column. Next within that wrapper, I could say like, well, I'm going to do one div here, I'm going to do one div here, one div here, one div here, but let's work in big sections first. So next within the wrapper, I'm going to have one big div for the header, one big div for the content, and one big div for the footer, so that I can work with big sections first. So let's start to build this out. I'm going to go to a blank HTML template. And again, this can be a really simple one here. And I'm just going to save this as index.html. So if, again, when I go to zip this later on, this index.html is the one for our build out. Let's also, while we're at it, go ahead and create a CSS document. So I'm going to do new. I'm going to save this as just simply style.css. And in our index.html, in the head, I'm going to do the link tag, type, text CSS, rel, style sheet, and the href is going to be the style CSS. So, before I get into the CSS, we always want to start with the HTML. We might make changes to the HTML later. We'll very likely change the HTML later. But it's always a good idea to start with the HTML and our actual content before we get into the CSS. So, like I said, with the body, I'm going to be doing that background image. But the very next thing inside the body is going to be this center column. So I'm going to create a div. And I'm going to give it an ID. We could call this column. We could call it centered. Very often we call it wrapper. And it's just a common web designer thing. You want to call it something that makes the most sense to you. And as always, if you're kind of working on with a team of people, you kind of want to talk about different conventions that you use for that. So we have a div that is going to be our wrapper, and pretty much everything else in our HTML is going to go inside of this wrapper. Let's actually even take out some of these line breaks here. Okay. So next, we're going to have our header, our content, and our footer. So, we could do the header in one of two ways. We could say div with the ID header. We could also use the header tag. Very often you'll see tags like this as far as like header or footer. Sometimes you might see tags like section or aside. Using this type of what's called a more semantic tag, something that's slightly more descriptive, rather than doing the div with the ID header, it really makes no difference whatsoever until you actually put CSS to it. So just by using the div with the ID header or using the header tag doesn't make a difference in the HTML at all. It's just another way of identifying it in my HTML. But until I actually give this some properties within our CSS, both of them are exactly the same. So if you would like to kind of minimize like having 1,000 divs in your HTML, and just making sure that every single one has like a different ID, there may be a couple places like where you would say well, yeah, let's use the header tag here, let's use the footer tag here. If section means something to you, then you can use that tag. And you can also give these tags their own IDs. So maybe you call this top header, and maybe there's another header that's called menu, for example. It's up to you. You have a lot of different options when it comes to actually defining it in the HTML. Yeah, let's go ahead and use the header tag in this case. We'll use the header and the footer tag. I'm not going to use the section or aside for right now, but we're going to use this header tag for this top section here. We're going to use the footer tag for this bottom section here. And for the middle, we're going to go ahead and use a div with the ID. And this is a personal preference just of mine. Again, feel free to use the tag names that make the most sense to you. The only thing you will just want to be careful about is there are going to be tags that have their own properties already set to them. For example, the paragraph tag automatically has a little bit of margin adding to it. It's not a blank slate. Divs, headers, and footers are blank slates. Section and aside as well, I believe, are all blank slates. But you just want to be careful about just using any tag out of the book. Because the sorry, you're saying?
The word body instead of content, will that mix up with the general body?
Well, body is a reserved thing. We have to have the body in there, and that's going to wrap around just about everything. Where we have content, that's one that I'm making up right now.
The word body with the
Oh, so you're saying if you wanted to also put it in a body here? Yeah, I wouldn't do that. That I'll be honest, I've never done that before. I'm not sure how that would mess things up, but I have a feeling that would cause certain conflicts, maybe between different browsers. So I would stay away from using the body tag, except for the one that goes around everything. Yeah, I very often will teach from divs just because a lot of times they're like the safest ones to use. But like I said, there are other options out there which will help to make your HTML a bit more readable. You want to choose a style that is going to, as you go back to your code, is going to be as clear as possible. But yeah. Oh, you were also asking about the H. Yeah, so the H1 and the
H1, 2, 3,
yeah.
7, they have the little bit of reserve.
Yeah, they also have their own margins and paddings around them. They also have their own font weights and font styles to them. So if you wanted to create a heading, different than a header, if you want to create a heading that is all on your own, you don't want to have to worry about what style is already on the H1s, H2s, things like that. I would just do like a div with an ID, heading 1, heading 2, things like that. That way you don't have to worry about overwriting that content from before. So we have the wrapper, we have the header, and I'm going to have a div with an ID, with the ID content. So these are going to be our 3 major sections within the wrapper, within the body. Again, you could have, I mean, I'm counting 8 different objects here. You could have 8 different divs all within the body, but this helps you to kind of keep things a bit more organized by working from the outside in and working from these major sections first. So, let's take a look at the logo and the menu that goes within this. So within the header, there's a few different ways of doing a navigation. For right now, I'm going to start with a slightly simpler one, where I just simply have, since these are all images themselves, I'm just going to simply put in the images in a straight line. So we're going to have an image tag, where the SRC is going to go inside of our images folder, and it's going to look for this logo 0.jpg. And then we're going to have the images for the about, the journal, the gallery, and the video. So we're going to have image, src equals, images, logo 0.png. We're also going to put in an image tag for that first one, which is the video in this case. Images, and that is just video 0.png. Image, src, images, about 0.png. So about Then call it gallery. Oh, it's because they had an SRG in there. Should be SRC. SRC images and yep, journal .png. Journal 0.png. That could be like a history page. Alright, yeah. So we have the logo and we have our 4 different menu items. Now, how we actually position that, we could do a couple of things in our CSS. We could also even add a little bit more to our HTML here in order to make that positioning simpler. But for now, let's just work with that content in there. So we have our header. We have our 5 items that should be in our header in the HTML. So now let's go on to the content. So in our content, we have 2 different sections here. We have one for this video, and we have one for this text box here. So within the div with the ID content, I'm going to go ahead and create another div. Now there is a video tag, but we would not use it if we're trying to embed something from YouTube. We would use something else. But for now, we're just going to put in that image. And we're going to start off by having a div with the ID video. And we're going to have a div with the ID text box. So within video and within text box, this is where we'd actually put in that content. But for now, just so we're starting off with something simple, for now I'm just going to put in the actual screenshot, just the crop of the video.jpg as well as the text.png. So within video, I'm going to put in an image tag, src, images, video.jpg, and within the text box I'm going to put in an image, src, images, text.png. Yes, it can sometimes be a little bit daunting if we're trying to put in a bunch of our end code all in there all at once. Sometimes just to kind of keep things simple, just to kind of help us to get something on the screen that's at least visual. You know, it's perfectly fine to start off with just images of, like, you know, the crops from our design, so that we can get at least a general sense of the position and the size that it should exist on screen. So we have the body. Inside the wrapper, we have the header, content, and footer. Inside the header, we have our 5 items for the logo and the 4 menu items. Inside our content, we have our video and our text box. And for our footer, we're pretty much just going to have that one image. Footer is going to be really simple, at least in this design. So in the footer, we just have, what do we call that? Footer.png. It's almost like I knew what I was going to use it for. So, we have our HTML set up, and this is, again, it's going to get more complicated even for this simple of a design, but this gives us something to work off of with our CSS, just so we can get some of the basics ready to go. Yes?
If you were to just use Google Fonts like this for your header, how would you
I always recommend using live type if you can, unless the exception would just be like maybe like something for like this logo where it's kind of a complicated thing of different sizes and weights that you want to make sure is in the exact same place. But yeah, you definitely want to use the live type if you can't find something with Google Fonts. So what we're doing with the image tags would be very similar to what we would do with real text, just because they're inline elements. So yeah, so it's going to start off just they're going to be in a line, And let's take a look at like the way this looks even without any CSS. Okay. So right now we have our header. Our header has our 5 different images in them, and right now they're just simply stacked right next to each other. We also have our video div. We have our text box div, and we have our footer div. I don't know. I think this is perfect. I think it looks good. No. Obviously, we want to kind of space things out a little bit more. We want to kind of center things the way that we have in our design. We still have a little bit of work cut out for us in our CSS. One more thing I just realized I wanted to add to the HTML before we get into the CSS is that for our menu, our navigation here at the top, whether we have images in here or not, for a navigation, we typically want to have anchor tags, which would surround either the images or the literal text. That would be for our navigation. Now, like I said, there's another way of doing a navigation where you're using the UL tag and you're using the LI tags also within that. I'd like to kind of save that if we can, but for now, we're just simply going to add in some anchor tags around each of these images. So for the logo, that's just going to go to our home page, which is index.html. I'm going to start off with that anchor tag here and end that anchor tag right after the image. I copied the beginning anchor tag here, and I'm going to paste it right before the beginning image tag. This would go to video.html. Let's end that anchor tag. This would go to about.html. This would go to gallery.html. And this would go to journal.html. Which, like I said, can be the equivalent of a history page. Okay. So that doesn't really make much of a difference in our style here. You might see it on certain browsers, like a slight blue line around all these images, but we'll get to that in a second. So let's take a look at our CSS. And like I said, we want to work from the outside in. So let's start with the body. So just for good measure, let's go ahead and put in the margin 0 pixels and the padding 0 pixels. I almost always do that at the very beginning of my CSS, just because I don't want to have to necessarily worry about that extra margin or that extra padding if I want things flush later on. So the main thing we want to do with the body is we want to add in the background. So we're going to put in a background image, and just like we did last week, we're going to put in URL instead of parentheses and a semicolon. Background image is one of the stranger CSS properties. We have this URL, this parentheses, to specify where this image is supposed to exist. But within those parentheses, we have a set of quotations, and inside those quotations, it's going to work just like we have the src for image or the href for the anchor tags. It's going to be the path to that image as well as the image file name. So in this case, from this style CSS, this is the file we're actually editing. From the style CSS, we're going to go inside the images folder, and then we're going to find this background.jpg. So from here, we're going to put in the images folder, and then bg.jpg for that file. Now, as you remember from last week, there's a few other background properties that we typically put in. We very often will use a background repeat if we do not want it to repeat. So we're going to put in background repeat, and then the value for that is going to simply be the words no dash repeat. There are times when you want to use a pattern, which you might not have to have that. But if you do not want to repeat, we're going to put in background repeat, no repeat. Next, we're going to put in background size. Let's go with that. With my design, I don't care about seeing every edge of this space. It's space. We can crop it as we need to. So when it comes to the background size, the main thing you're asking yourself is whether or not we want to crop the image itself. If we do not want to crop the image because there's something important in that background, we don't want to crop people's faces, or we don't want to crop something important that's actually going on in the image. If we do not want to crop things, then we use contain. And it's going to show our background with a background color around that image. But it's not going to crop it. If we do want to crop it, or rather we don't care about cropping it, then we're going to use background size cover. Background size cover will make sure that all edges of the browser window are covered by that background image, so it's just going to crop it as it needs to. Now, how it's actually going to crop it is going to be dependent on the background position. So we have background dash position, and we typically use two words in here. We could do a top left, which means it's going to crop it from that top left corner. We could do top center, which means that it's going to keep it at the top, but it's going to make sure it's centered horizontally. We could also just simply do center, which means that it will crop it from that center point, whether or not it needs to have it from the top or not. We could do center. I kind of think that makes the most sense for this particular background. I mean, it's space, it's fine. It also has just a little bit of feathering in the corners too, so I think from the center kind of makes the most sense. And we'll see what that looks like in real time in a minute. Let's see what it looks like right now. That's fine. So we have this background image as we resize the browser itself. You can see the position of it is doing it from the center. And again, we're covering over as much of this background, including the content itself. It's covering over as much of this background as it can, so that we're not seeing any sort of background color, but it is going to be cropping this image. Now, this page, when it's all done, it probably won't scroll. But let's say that we do have pages that do scroll, and we don't want the background to scroll with it. We just want the content to scroll on top. The last background property we're going to add is background attachment, and the value for that is going to be fixed. It's another kind of odd one. I'm not sure why they would define it that way. I would say background dash don't move. But we have background dash attachment, and we have the value as fixed. And that means that as we scroll, it's going to be fixed in that space, so that we're sure that the galaxies and everything is going to stay in the same place as we scroll. Any questions on that so far? Okay. So we're working from the outside in. We have the majority of what we want for the body. Next, let's take a look at the wrapper. So for the wrapper, we have that as a div with the ID wrapper, so we're going to do div hash wrapper. Now here, just like we were doing in the previous lesson, we're going to use both a width as well as a margin 0 pixels auto. Now I should say that the main things that's making it a center column is the width and as well as the auto on the left and right. You don't have to do a 0 pixels, and in fact, there are times when you want to start it off with a little bit of space from the top. But Yes, the main thing that we're mostly concerned with is having some sort of width, as well as having an auto or the left of right, a margin left of right. So the width in this case, we want to consider what the width of this screen is. So we can take a quick guess here. This is in inches. Why do I have this in inches? I never set this to inches. Photoshop must have... Oh boy. How about this? Yeah, this is just as, yeah, eventually I'm gonna have to set the, yeah, I'm gonna reset the units there. Yeah. But I just wanted to get like a really general size on this. The width of this this content area, not considering the stuff outside of the edge of this footer or the edge of this logo, is approximately 1050 pixels. I'm going to set it to be a little bit more than that, just to kind of make sure that we have a little bit of breathing room to work with. Let's go with 1100 pixels. So we're going to use 1100 pixels for the width. We have a margin 0 pixels auto, which means now as I look at it, we have a centered column. So as I resize the browser, it's going to center that 1100 pixel width until I get underneath that, and then yeah, we do have to scroll over. In the later web classes, you're going to be learning more about responsive design, whereas no matter how you scroll, resize the browser, it's going to scale the rest of the content accordingly. But yeah, we have that centered column to work with. Next, let's take a look at... we're running out of time. Okay, let's take a look at the content for a quick second. So, let's go to do div hash content. And this is includes both the video as well as the text box. For the content itself, I'm going to say if we want to float the video as well as the text box next to each other, what I would recommend for the content is to start off with saying overflow and auto. This is going to make the spacing when it comes to the content as well as the footer and the header a little bit easier. But that's just the container for the two things we want to put next to each other. So when we use overflow auto on the container for the things that we're going to be floating, it's going to make the positioning as far as the margins a little bit easier to work with. Right now, if we want to position this content area, what includes both the video as well as the text box, if we want to set up the margin a little bit from the header and a little bit from the footer, we can just simply use margin top on that. But as soon as we start floating things inside of that container, then the margins start to act a little bit unpredictably. So that's why we have overflow auto on this, because it's just going to reset how we're going to be doing the margins on that and make that a little bit more clear. We don't use overflow auto on everything. We just use it on containers for things that are going to be floating. So we're not using overflow auto on the header or the footer. We're just using it on this content because it's going to contain things which are going to be floating. So for the video, we're going to do div hash video, and for that we're going to say float left, and we're also going to do that for the text box, div hash text box, float left. But if you remember, we don't just simply, we can actually do this float right. So, we could do float left or float right. Oh, we'll explain in a minute. But we don't just simply want to do a float left or right. We also want to kind of rein in the width. So the width of our video right now is... the width of our video is about 640, and the width of our text box is 383 pixels. So with the video, we're going to set the width to 640 pixels, and the text box, we set the width to 383 pixels. So we have the overflow auto on the container, and we have a float left on the video as along with the width, and we have a float right on the text box, again, along with the width. So now we have the header, we have the content area, and we have the footer all within these rows. Now, I don't know about you, but these do feel a little bit crowded all together. So let's go ahead and space these out a little bit. For the header, let's go ahead and space it out a little bit from the top. So let's go ahead and create a definition for that header. Now, right now, I don't have any IDs on the header. I could put an ID on the header if I wanted to, if I have multiple headers. But if I only have one header, then that's just using the tag name itself is fine. So we're going to say header, we're going to do a margin top, and let's just do 20 pixels. That just spaces it a little bit from the top. Now, for the header, I could also do a margin bottom, but let's be consistent. If we know how much we're spacing all these out, let's always do the margin top, and we can do the margin top on the header, we'll do a margin top on the content, and we'll do a margin top on the footer. And if we're setting them all to a margin top of 20 pixels, then we know they're all going to be spaced out approximately the same from each other. So, last thing is with the header, with the links that we have for our menu in the header. Now, there are several different ways that we can do this. If the, one way that we're going to be doing is, like I said, I'm going to be showing you the way with the UL tag with the LIs, which is a very common way. However, the HTML can look confusing at first. So let's start with this, a simpler way. So first, we have these anchor tags and we have these images, and right now, without any extra content, they're pretty much all right next to each other. Any extra space that you see here is just within that image itself. If I take a look at this image, you can see that it is just exactly right before and right after this logo. So, one way that we can space this out is by trying to put actual spaces in between the anchor tags. Now, you'll notice that if I just simply put in a line break and I just put in a bunch of spaces between the logo and the video, that doesn't make any difference to the HTML at all. As far as the browser is concerned, no matter how many individual spaces we have here, it considers all of this between this anchor tag and this anchor tag to be just one space. It ignores any extra spaces there. That's kind of a good thing, because that allows us to do extra tabs and our own sort of positioning with our HTML in a way that makes the most sense to us, without worrying about if this is adding too much space here. But if we want to add in manual space so that the browser actually considers that space for us, one way that we can do that is with the value It's ampersand N B S P and a semicolon. So ampersand NBSP, weirdly enough, counts for exactly one space. So every time we put in that and NBSP, the browser is going to consider that to be one space. I wish it wasn't quite so complicated, but whenever you start putting the ampersand, it allows you to put in a lot of other kinds of special characters. So it's just the HTML way of putting in a special character that you can't normally type out. So the way that they decided to do a space is just and NBSP. So what we can do is we can just do a bunch of those between our two anchor tags. And that will actually start to create some space there. And if we want to make sure that all of them have the same amount of space, we would just use the same number of NBSPs between each of these anchor tags.
It's not better to create a box, to create them inside of a box with a clear background.
So we can. Like I said, there's a few different ways that we can do this. One way that we can do this, if we're just using inline elements, is that we can put in manual NBSPs. Another way that we can do this is that we can treat these like boxes. So whether or not we want to actually create a div around these different anchor tags, or we can actually treat the anchor tags themselves as blocked elements. What we can do is in the header, in our CSS, we can put in header space A, and now this is talking about the anchor tags that are specifically, this is talking about the anchor tags that are specifically inside of this header tag. And we can do display block. We have to set that as display block because the only way we're going to be able to add padding is if it is a block level element. So we either add in divs around each of these anchor tags to create blocks that way, and we can put in a class, or we can treat the anchor tags themselves as blocks, and then that will allow us to do padding. However, as soon as we say display block, it's going to try to put all of these on their own lines. So in addition to display block, we would also need to say float left, so that they're all floating next to each other. And then we can add in padding around those blocks. But one thing you'll notice is that when we're doing the float left, we have all these other things that are trying to float to the left of that. So around the header, let's go ahead and put in an overflow of auto. Right. Yes. So we put it.
Add a width to it.
So we can only add in a width or a padding if it's a block level element. So as soon as we put in display block, we have to also float it left if we need to make them horizontal next to each other.
Okay.
So then once it's a floating left, we could put in a width. Like if we do a width of 300, then it's going to make each of these 300 wide. So you would just need to adjust it that way. So this is 200. Or, in this particular case, I think it's going to make more sense to use padding. So I'm going to say padding, and if I say 0 pixels at the top and bottom, and then I say 30 pixels on the left and right, that's going to add in 30 pixels of padding on either side of these anchor tags. So we have to make it a little bit smaller in order to fit in here. And it's one of those cases where you would save, refresh, save, and refresh to see what the difference actually is there. So this allows us to control it a little bit more in the HTML We have to add in a few other things as far as like the overflow, as well as the block, as in the floats and things like that. But that gives us a little bit more control doing it on like a pixel by pixel basis, rather than doing the NBSPs in between each one. There's just one more that I want to show you, just really, really quick. And I'm trying to remember if I have an image for this. Okay. So if we have in Photoshop, I'm just going to go ahead and create a 1 pixel by 1 pixel image. Layer from the background and ignore it. That way we have a 1 pixel by 1 pixel transparent image here. I'm going to save that as a GIF, and I'm going to save it as I'm going to save in our images as spacer.gif. So now we have an image inside of our images folder. This is called spacer.gif. It is a 1 pixel by 1 pixel transparent image. What I can do is between each of these anchor tags, I can add in an image where the SRC is going to go to that spacer.gif. And I'm going to give that a class that I'm just going to call spacer. I can call this whatever I want, but might as well call it spacer. I'm going to put that GIF in between each of these anchor tags here. Now, if I use that, then I don't necessarily need to do this display block thing. I don't need to do the overflow auto on the header. What I can do is I can reference that image tag with that class spacer. I'm going to set the height of it to 1 pixel, and I'm going to set the width of it to something else, like 30 pixels. What this is going to do is it's going to add in that image in between each of these anchor tags. And right now that image is 30 pixels. But if I were to increase that width in my CSS, I could add in more or less space that way. So that's a nice way of doing kind of in between, where we don't have to put each of these anchor tags inside of blocks, where we have to do the floating and the padding and things like that. We also don't have to necessarily do a bunch of those NBSPs, but we just have an image which is just completely transparent, and we are able to manipulate the width and height of that image in our CSS. That way we can have a pixel perfect amount of space in between each of those menu items without necessarily, like I said, doing the padding or the width option. So we have those 3 options that I'm showing you so far. I'm going to show you again another one next time, as far as just doing some really basic spacing between different anchor tags that are going to represent menu. But yeah.